Hi church, happy Bible study day. It's 3:30, so it's that time. We finished 1st and 2nd Peter, so I thought we would take a trip to the Old Testament and begin working our way through the book of Judges. I've chosen Judges because it's kind of a time of unrest, kind of a confusing time as people are trying to figure out who they are. It's also a great story collection. We're going to meet people like Deborah and Gideon and find out about them. I have done some of this before, but not in this way where we literally just are going to walk through. We're going to do probably about 2 chapters a week, but that may change based on what the storyline is. This first week, though, we will do chapters 1 and 2. So, before we get into it, though, I thought we might be able to pray our way in. So if you join me in a prayer. Dear God, as we begin to enter into your word, we ask that you bring to our hearts hope, that you bring to our hearts whatever our needs are right now, be they calm or healing, be they love, food, whatever our needs are, anguish, employment. Lord, you know what we are thinking, what we are feeling. No one else can fully know what another is thinking at that moment, what another is feeling at that moment. So we know, though, that you do, that you hear within us, that you see within us, that you know our past, our present, and our future, and that you are with us in all of it. So Lord, just in this time and in this place, be with each person that's watching this, be with their family, their loved ones, and most of all, be with our country and our world in this time. We ask this in your name. Amen. So if we go to 1st Judges, what are we going to encounter? We're going to encounter a community that is in a very strange place. So if you remember, if you look at Judges, it's going to be near the front of your Bible. You've got a book called Genesis, and then you got Exodus. So Genesis means the beginning, and then Exodus is when they exit, they leave, right? And then Leviticus is going to be that law book, and then you got Deuteronomy, which is kind of, there's more laws and numbers and things like that. But you're going to keep going through those books, and you're going to find yourself coming eventually to Joshua, right? Now those first books of the Bible, they are meant to kind of lay out some groundwork. They're called the Torah. They have a special set asideness for the Old Testament, but we're kind of jumping past that, right? So God's already given these covenants. God's already walked with the people through things. Now I have to tell you, one of my least favorite books of the Bible is Joshua, because I think it's really hard to read it as somebody who supports Native tribes and Native people. And I've done papers and studies on this, how to read Joshua with Native American people, because it's all about kicking out the Native American people, the people who were native in the land. And for this case, it's the Canaanites, right? And so I do find that to be a difficult book to read, and we're going to go past that, right? But this is right after Joshua. And now Joshua himself is a great leader, though. I want to say this. Joshua is an excellent type general, faithful to God. He really follows the rule. Now at the beginning of Judges, though, what we're finding is that Joshua is dying, and there's not really somebody who's going to step up to take that place. When Moses died, Joshua fit right in. It was a very smooth transition. He had trained somebody. Joshua, we had seen him earlier in the ranks. He was one of those scouts. He was really being trained for a position of power. Unfortunately, nobody really stepped up into that role when Joshua died. So we're going to see that right at the beginning of Judges. So Judges is also going to be a time of like taking out the native people, but in a different way, because we're going to find that it's not so much just coming in and moving them from the land. It's going to get more difficult. So let's go into it. Let's go to Judges 1. And I do want to tell you the one other piece. So Judges, when we think about the word as American Protestants, we probably think Judges as in like court trials and stuff like that. Now there's going to be parts of that that seem very much like that. Deborah especially reminds me of a judge in a court. But what you're going to find, I think, is that the original Hebrew is not like that at all. It's more like people who are trying to do the right thing. People who step up into active roles, hero roles to do the right thing. So let's go into it. Judges 1. After Joshua died, so right there, right at the beginning, okay? It starts that we'll see kind of the death of Joshua a little bit in 2 too, but right from the beginning. After Joshua died, the Israelites asked the Lord which tribe should attack the Canaanites first. The Lord answered, Judah, for I have given them victory over the land. So Judah's going to start with the Lord's permission to start attacking. The leaders of Judah said to their relatives from the tribe of Simeon, "Join with us to fight against the Canaanites living in the territory allocated to us. Then we will help you conquer your territory." So the men of Simeon went with Judah. When the men of Judah attacked, the Lord gave them victory over the Canaanites and Perizzites, and they killed 10,000 enemy warriors at the town of Bezek. So they are taking out a lot of people, but notice these are enemy warriors. So these aren't just local people in the land. These are they're fighting against fighters. And we're going to see that because you're going to get to verse 7. And in verse 7, Adonibezek escaped, but the Israelites soon captured him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. What is the point of this? Cutting off somebody's thumb makes it really hard to hold a sword, right? The thumb gives you, I've done fencing, I know you need that thumb to hold you in place. If you don't have it, the sword really has no stability. So that was their goal, to make it so they could no longer fight. Adonibezek said, "I once had 70 kings with thumbs and big toes cut off, eating scrapes from under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them." They took him to Jerusalem and died there. So he realizes that karma has come to him, right? He was a fighter. He now has other people fighting against him. His time has come. He's lost the battle. And you're going to continue with this. In verse 8, the men of Judah attacked Jerusalem and captured it, killing all its people and setting the city on fire. So that is a very different fight than just a minute ago, right? So they've set the whole city on fire. It's not just the warriors at this point. Then they turned south to fight the Canaanites living in the hill country. This is where most of Judges is going to take place, is in the south. Judah marched against the Canaanites in Hebron, formally. And so some of this you're going to start to see is just going to continue. But what's interesting is there's this little sub-story starting in verse 12, where it says, "Then Caleb said, I will give my daughter in marriage to the one who attacks and captures Kirsathsefra." And I'm sorry if I mess up, Judges. These are words that are hard to say. So we're just going to say he's got to capture that K-town. And what's going to happen is the son of Caleb's younger brother, Kenaz, actually is the one to capture it. So she becomes his wife. She becomes the younger brother's son's wife. And that's not important for you, but what is important for you is to note, there's this little sub-story here on verse 14. When she married him, she urged him to ask her father for an additional field. She gets down off her donkey. Caleb asked her, "What is it?" to his daughter. "What can I do for you?" She said, "Give me a further blessing. You have been kind enough to give me land in the Negev. Please give me springs as well." So Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs. What's powerful about this story is this shows how smart his daughter was, not just him. She realized that if you're going to live in a desert, land's great and all in a desert, it's important to get land, but what's the point of land if you don't have water in a desert? So very smart little insert here that there's really no point for them putting it in, but it does give us a personal piece of Caleb, and actually shows us a woman who really knew what she was talking about. So they're going to continue on in this. We're going to see that people are settling in the desert. What's going to be interesting, though, is that there are going to be towns that are destroyed. Hormah itself means destruction, the town. Judah's going to capture cities like Gaza, ones that you would know, as well as some problems you don't hear so much about, Ekron. In verse 19, the Lord is with the people of Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. Now here's where the change is going to happen. But they failed to drive out the people living in the plains because the people there had iron chariots. Whoa. So God's people in this story now aren't able to eradicate the land. They aren't able to get the local people out. And that's interesting for us because it's showing that there's a shift in the covenant. Before, God was purely with the people all the time. Here, God's beginning to say, hey, I'm not always going to be with you in the actions that you take. If you take the wrong actions, God's going to say, that's not what I wanted you to do. So why are you doing this? And to say that a little bit, we know, for example, so yes, there is actual fear here. A Canaanite chariot was one of the most powerful weapons of the time. It kept them higher off the ground. A lot of Israelites people were foot soldiers, so they weren't able to defend against this big chariot that's coming through at a fast speed and wiping out whole armies of foot soldiers. But what is beginning is, you'll see in the next couple verses that the Israelites are having to live among the Canaanites more. They aren't just taking over. They don't see this as fully just their promised land that only they get to live in. They're having to live with other people. And us in today's world, we understand that that's more difficult, isn't it? When people have different values, different virtues, maybe different religions, different stories, different pasts, different presents, how do you live among people and make it work? And that's what they're beginning to have to ask themselves in Judges. It's a different storyline for them than they faced before. So if we continue, we're going to see pretty much from verse 19 to the end of this chapter, it's just a line of how they're starting to kind of have to deal with this new reality for them. Verse 27, the tribe of Manasseh failed to drive out the people living in Bethshanah. And it tells them the Canaanites were determined to stay in that region. When the Israelites grew stronger, they forced the Canaanites to work as slaves, but they never did drive them out of the land. Other places, it's going to have it almost flipped. Verse 31, the tribe of Asher also failed to drive out their residents. In fact, because they did not drive them out, the Canaanites dominated the land where Asher lived. So in some places, even though they don't fully eradicate any of these, sometimes they're able to make people slaves, or they themselves become slaves of others. They become the lesser known community. So in some cases, the Israelites are having to be the minority. And in other cases, they're the majority, and how to live in those kind of interactions together. Verse 34, as for the tribe of Dan, the Amorites forced them into the hill country and would not let them come down into the plains. The Amorites were determined to stay in Mount Heres. Then it goes a little bit longer, but when the descendants of Joseph became stronger, they forced the Amorites to work as slaves. So in some cases, they gain the upper hand, they lose the upper hand, it goes back and forth. Now we get to chapter 2. Chapter 2, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim with a message for the Israelites. He told them, I brought you out of Egypt into this land that I swore to give to your ancestors. Now that's covenant language. They've heard that before. And I said I would never break my covenant with you. For your part, you were not to make any covenants with people living in this land. Instead, you were to destroy their altars. Why then have you disobeyed my commandments? Since you have done this, I will no longer drive out the people living in your land. They will be thorns in your side, and their gods will be a constant temptation to you. When the angel of the Lord finished speaking, the Israelites wept loudly. So they called the place Weeping, and they offered sacrifices to the Lord. The sun is changing on me a little bit, so I'm going to come this way. So we begin to see that God is aware that things are happening in a different way. And I like the version I have. I was doing some research on this, and I found a very interesting piece here. I want to share this part with you. Tribe after tribe failed to drive the evil Canaanites, and remember that is interpretation, right? Evil Canaanites from their land. Why didn't they follow through and completely obey God's command? 1, they had been fighting for a long time and were tired. Although the goal was in sight, they lacked the discipline and energy to reach it. 2, they were afraid the enemy was too strong, the iron chariot seemed invincible. 3, since Joshua's death, power, and authority had been decentralized to the tribal leaders and the tribes were no longer unified in purpose. 4, spiritual decay had infected them from within. They thought they could handle the temptation and be more prosperous by doing business with the Canaanites. We too often fail to drive sin from our lives. Often we know what to do, but we just don't follow through. This results in a gradual deterioration of our relationship with God. In our battles, we may grow tired and want rest, but we need more than a break from our work. We need to know that God loves us and has given us a purpose for life. Victory comes from living according to His purpose. This event marks a significant change in Israel's relationship with God. At Mount Sinai, God made a sacred and binding agreement with the Israelites called a covenant. God's part was to make Israel a special nation, to protect them, and to give them unique blessings for following Him. Israel's part was to love God. The agreement was to protect them. But because they rejected and disobeyed God, the agreement to protect them was no longer in effect. But God wasn't going to abandon His people. They would receive wonderful blessings if they asked God to forgive them and sincerely followed Him again. Although God's agreement to help Israel conquer the land was no longer in effect, His promise to make Israel a nation through who the whole world would be blessed remained valid. So I find this very interesting because I think what it's saying here is, sure, there were lots of reasons that Israel wasn't able to conquer fully the land like it does in the book before us in Joshua. But I think there's also another piece of this. It's a reminder that we don't always have power. And that doesn't mean God has left us when we don't have power in situations. It just means we have to learn how to follow God in a new way. So I know a lot of people probably feel powerless right now. You feel like your life is not what you want. You're probably grieving the life you thought you have. You're wondering how life can be okay again. That's kind of what Judges is about. It's how do you live into a new normal? And so we're going to kind of walk through that. How do we begin to live in a situation where we don't have complete power in our lives? And the truth is we probably never did, right? There's a B. So how do you live in a situation where kind of redefining what it means to be a person among other people and live the best you can as God's chosen people, right? As God's beloved. How do you live in a situation? How do you live in a situation where it's uncomfortable, where there are temptations, that word they used? I think we all face that at times. How do we learn to not give up? So in chapter 2, we're going to go a little further. We're going to go into chapter 2. After Joshua sent the people away, each of the tribes left to take possession of the land allocated to them. And the Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the leaders who outlived him, those who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Then Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the land he had inherited. So, Joshua is a great leader in our Bible. And so now he's passed away, and it tells us in verse 10, after that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight and worshipped the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They chased all after other gods, worshipping the gods of the people around them. And they angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Asheroth. This made the Lord burn with anger against Israel, so he handed them over to marauders who stole their possessions. He sold them to their enemies all around them, and they were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, bringing them defeat, just as he promised, and the people were very distressed. I think that section really speaks for itself in a lot of ways. What's happening is a change with the generation. Give me a second here. Keep hydrated, church. There's a change in generations, and the people that were before that knew the stories of God, that had lived through the Exodus possibly even, that knew what had happened, how God's covenant with them. It was very internalized. They'd experienced it. But when that generation passed away, the new generation that came in didn't know what was going on. And I think we face that now, right? In the 1950s and 40s was the high point of the church, right? More people were going to church around World War II time than we'd seen in America's history. That generation has largely passed. There might be still some alive, but not many, right? And so the next generations that come, we now have generations that don't know God at all, don't know the stories of Jesus Christ. And so part of that is, how do you train them to begin to have a relationship with God? And some of you might be those people that are learning your way into a relationship with God. And it's not going to be as easy as if the entire country was very clearly Christian before, because like we talked about here, they're beginning to have to learn to live among other people. And so that's also, though, a benefit, because that means people who are waiting out there who don't know about Jesus, and we get to share that story. So instead of seeing it as a negative that the next generations don't know, I see it as a positive that we get to share our story, and we get to increase the good news into the world. So then you go on, verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges. And this is where we start to see, we're going to see in chapter 3 next week, judges that are starting to arise. We're going to learn about some of them. Yet Israel did not listen to the judges. So what's going to happen is there's going to be this cycle throughout Judges, that the judge will rise up, the people will do better, they'll listen to God, the judge will die, they'll fall apart, then a new judge rise up, they'll listen to God, then the judge will die, and they'll fall apart. We're going to see that cycle over and over again. So it's kind of telling us that ahead of time. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors who had walked in obedience to the Lord's command. Whenever a Lord placed a judge over Israel, he was with that judge and rescued the people from their enemies throughout the judge's lifetime. So God was with the people. He rose up a hero. We see this throughout all of history. Heroes, leaders that rise up, right, to help give a witness. People like Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Jr., Martin Luther, right? People that rise up with a voice that sets us on a new path. And then when that person leaves, it's hard. Charismatic leaders are few and far between. And so that's kind of, I invite you to read that section from 16 to the end of chapter 2, because that is going to set the stage for where we're going. And it does say, verse 20, so the Lord burned with anger against Israel. He said, because these people have violated the covenant I made with their ancestors and have ignored my commands, I will no longer drive out the nations that Joshua left unconquered when he died. I did this to test Israel. So sometimes there are tests. Jesus tells us not to test God, but it doesn't mean that sometimes God doesn't test us. How are we living into challenges? How are we working through things? God's kind of giving us opportunities to grow. Are you growing right now? Is your faith expanding in challenging times? Is your hope expanding in challenging times? So these are going to be some of the questions that we're going to face as we look at Judges. How do you live in times that are not easy? How do you continue to keep your faith when not everybody around it has that faith? How do you not give up hope? How do you hold on to leadership? Sometimes great leadership, sometimes not great leadership. How do we follow the right path? How do we choose the right path for ourselves with God's support? These are all some kind of questions that I look forward to answering alongside you. All right, friends, we'll continue more next week. See you then.